small airplane, with its hum of engines and packed cabin, became the setting for an unexpected confrontation. Pastor Matthew Robb, a man of faith known for his calm demeanor and unwavering conviction, found himself in the middle of an uproar. His simple act of wearing a cross necklace during a routine flight was enough to spark a storm, an incident so unusual, so unexpected, that it would ripple through the hearts of everyone on board. When a flight attendant approached him with a request to remove the cross, citing passenger complaints, the moment seemed surreal. How could something as innocent as a symbol of faith be a source of conflict in the skies? Matthew didn't flinch. Instead of responding with anger or indignation, he made a decision that would surprise everyone. He chose to stand firm, not in hostility, but in grace. As the tension swelled in the cabin, something strange began to unfold. The more Matthew refused to back down, the more the passengers began to whisper among themselves. Was he the one in the wrong? Or was this an act of courage, one that would test the limits of faith in a place where differences could be drowned out by the hum of engines and the confined space of a plane? The story of Matthew Robb's flight, one man's stand for his beliefs in the face of a world that wanted him to be silent, would become far more than a quiet act of rebellion. It would reveal inconsistencies and hidden truths, twists and turns that would lead to an unexpected revelation. But first, we need to understand why this flight, this moment, would become so crucial. Pastor Robb had always been the picture of peace. At 42, he was a gentle man, deeply committed to his ministry. His church had grown under his leadership, and his reputation was solid, a man whose word carried weight not because of his title, but because of his character. He'd faced challenges before, health issues, family struggles, but none of it ever shook his core. He wore his faith like a shield, a quiet confidence that never wavered. This flight from Dallas to New York seemed like just another step in his regular travels. But the unusual tension in the air that day couldn't have been predicted. As the plane ascended and the seatbelt signs blinked off, Pastor Robb settled into his seat, taking out his Bible to read. The stewardess, a woman in her late 20s named Jessica, walked up the aisle, and as she passed Matthew, her eyes briefly caught the silver cross around his neck. She frowned. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Matthew noticed it. Moments later, she was back, standing in front of him. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, her voice polite but strained. "I've been asked to request that you remove the cross you're wearing. Some passengers have expressed concerns." The words hit Matthew like a slap, but he didn't react. He simply nodded and asked, "Why?" "The complaints," Jessica explained, her voice faltering. "Some passengers feel uncomfortable, and it's causing a disturbance." Pastor Robb looked around the cabin. The passengers seemed to go about their business, but there was a palpable tension in the air. His cross, a symbol of his unwavering faith, was suddenly under scrutiny. Matthew knew he couldn't remove it. Not for anyone. Not for something so trivial as discomfort. "I'm afraid I can't do that," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "This cross is a part of me. I believe in standing firm in my faith, even in the face of adversity." Jessica's face tightened, clearly uncomfortable. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly conflicted but doing her job. "Sir, please understand, it's not about you personally. It's just the complaints. It's our policy to keep the peace." But Matthew wasn't backing down. "It's not about peace, Jessica. It's about conviction. If I remove my cross now, what message does that send?" The tension between them was thick, but Matthew wasn't the type to raise his voice. Instead, he kept his demeanor steady, a reflection of his deeply rooted faith. Jessica hesitated, but before she could respond, the man sitting next to Matthew spoke up. "Maybe you should just take it off," he said, his tone cold and dismissive. "It's just a necklace. Who cares?" Matthew turned his head, locking eyes with the man. His expression was firm, but his gaze carried an unspoken challenge. "You'd ask me to silence my faith because someone else feels uncomfortable?" The man stammered for a moment, but said nothing further. Jessica walked away, but the tension remained. Matthew felt the eyes of the passengers on him, some curious, some judgmental, and others openly hostile. He could sense it now, the division. But what struck him most wasn't the uncomfortable glances or murmurs. It was the sudden sense that something bigger was happening. What started as a small personal moment was quickly escalating into something much larger, an unforeseen conflict. As the hours passed, Matthew began to feel something shift in the air. It wasn't just about the cross anymore. It was about power, who had it, and who was being asked to relinquish it. Matthew's mind raced. He couldn't understand how something so simple could create such chaos. The inconsistency was glaring. He wasn't breaking any rules. There was no law forbidding religious expression on a plane, no guideline against wearing a cross. The flight attendants had no legal right to ask him to remove it, and yet they were pushing him to comply. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, a new question began to take shape in his mind. Why had this been such a big issue for the passengers? The complaints about his cross seemed to be more than just discomfort. There was something more to this. That's when Matthew started noticing the strange behaviors of those around him. The woman across the aisle, who had made the initial complaint, seemed oddly satisfied by the situation. She kept glancing at him with a smirk. And then there was the older gentleman sitting next to her, who Matthew realized had been eyeing him suspiciously from the start. Something didn't add up. As the flight neared its destination, Matthew began to connect the dots. The stewardess who had asked him to remove the cross seemed too compliant, too eager to push him to take it off. She wasn't the first flight attendant to act this way. There was another flight attendant, a man in his 40s, who had disappeared after the first exchange with Matthew. Where had he gone? Then the real bombshell came. Just as the captain announced their descent, the voice of the flight crew came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that we will be conducting a thorough investigation upon landing due to a disturbance caused by a passenger," the announcement said. "Please remain calm. Your safety is our priority." Matthew's heart skipped a beat. A disturbance caused by a passenger? The words felt wrong. He hadn't done anything out of line. He had been calm, collected, standing firm in his faith. Yet now he was being labeled the cause of a disruption. When the plane finally touched down, Matthew felt a sense of dread. He was sure something far more sinister was at play here, something he hadn't seen coming. The authorities were already waiting as the plane taxied to the gate. The flight attendants were speaking to them in low, hushed tones. The smirking woman who had complained earlier was pointing toward Matthew, and the older man was nodding in agreement. As Matthew stood to gather his things, he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Pastor Rob," a voice said, low and ominous. "We need you to come with us." A chill ran down Matthew's spine. The authorities didn't just want to question him, they wanted to arrest him. But for what? What had gone wrong? Why were they treating him like a criminal for something that seemed so innocent? As the officers escorted him off the plane, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There was something much bigger going on here, and he was about to uncover it. As the officers guided Pastor Matthew Robb off the plane, his mind raced. He'd barely processed the shocking announcement from the flight crew when the authorities arrived. The words "disturbance caused by a passenger" echoed in his head. A disturbance? Was this some kind of joke? The handcuffs were cold and tight around his wrists, but Matthew's calm remained intact. His thoughts were scattered. He couldn't understand what had gone wrong. This wasn't just a disagreement over a piece of jewelry. There was something deeper at play here, something that didn't add up. The authorities led him down a sterile corridor of the airport, past bustling travelers who glanced at him with confusion. Matthew could feel the weight of their eyes, but none of them seemed to understand what had happened. He had simply worn a cross. Was that really enough to warrant an arrest? One of the officers spoke up. "We're taking you to a holding area, Mr. Robb. We need to ask you some questions." His tone was businesslike, but Matthew could sense the underlying tension. It wasn't just about a cross anymore. This had gone far beyond that. Inside the holding room, Matthew sat at a small table, hands still cuffed. He couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. As the minutes ticked by, the door opened, and a tall officer with a stern expression walked in. "I'm Detective Brian Wells," the man said, flashing his badge. I need to ask you about what happened on that flight, Pastor. What exactly happened with your cross? Matthew took a deep breath, his voice steady but laced with frustration. I wore a cross. That's it. Piece of jewelry. I was told by the flight attendants that it caused a disturbance. Detective Wells didn't respond immediately. He stared at Matthew for a moment, almost as if measuring him. Then he dropped the bombshell. We've been getting some reports that the disturbance wasn't about your cross at all. Wells leaned in closer, his voice lowering. It's about something far more dangerous. Matthew's stomach twisted. What do you mean? The detective paused. There's a reason we had to arrest you, Pastor. You weren't just wearing a cross. You were part of something much bigger than a simple complaint. Suddenly, the walls seemed to close in around Matthew. He couldn't understand. His cross, his faith, these were the things that had defined him. And now they were being twisted into something dark, something criminal. But what? Wells continued, his voice cold and methodical. You see, Mr. Robb, we've been monitoring a group of individuals who have been using public spaces like flights, churches, and even social media to recruit for a much more dangerous cause. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes enarrobing. It's not about faith anymore, Pastor. It's about manipulation, propaganda, and using faith as a cover for something far more sinister. Matthew felt his pulse quicken. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Wells pushed a folder across the table, and Matthew's eyes fell on the documents inside. The first thing that caught his eye was the image, a picture of a man he didn't recognize, standing next to a group of smiling people in a church. But it was the caption underneath that made his blood run cold. It read, Pastor Matthew Robb, leader of the radical faith group recruiting from unsuspecting communities. The words felt like a slap to the face. This isn't me, Matthew protested, his voice shaking. I have no idea who that is. Wells wasn't convinced. We know who you are, Pastor Robb. You've been the target of an ongoing investigation for months. The same faith group that's been recruiting troubled individuals online, pushing dangerous ideologies, and using your name to cover their tracks. Matthew's mind spun. How could anyone link him to something like that? He dedicated his life to helping people, to spreading love and peace, not hatred and manipulation. But the more he looked at the picture, the more it started to sink in. The man in the photo was wearing the same kind of cross Matthew had worn on the flight. It was unmistakable. The same necklace. You're saying someone's been impersonating me? Matthew's voice was filled with disbelief. How can that be? I've never been involved with anything like this. Wells didn't look convinced. We need you to cooperate, Pastor. You might not be aware of it, but you're wrapped up in something much bigger than you think. The interrogation dragged on for hours. Matthew sat in that cold, sterile room, his mind racing. Who was this person using his name? Why was he being dragged into this web of lies and manipulation? The more he thought about it, the more the details seemed to slip through his fingers. Finally, a breakthrough came, one that made everything even more suspicious. A new agent, Agent Carla Hayes, entered the room with a stack of papers. Detective Wells, we found something, she said, her voice tense. Wells looked up. What is it? Agent Hayes tossed a file onto the table, her eyes flicking between Matthew and the detective. We've traced the IP address of the online activity linked to Pastor Robb's name. The same one that's been recruiting people for this radical group. Matthew leaned forward. What did you find? Agent Hayes looked at him carefully before answering. It wasn't your IP address, Pastor. It was traced to a different location. A location that seems familiar. The file opened to reveal a name Matthew had not heard in years. The name of a man from his past. Someone who had once been a close friend, but had disappeared under strange circumstances. Michael Hargrave, Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible. Michael Hargrave. The name felt like a ghost from another life. Matthew hadn't thought about Michael in over a decade. Michael had been his closest friend in college, a fellow theology student, someone Matthew had trusted with his deepest thoughts. But after a series of tragic events, Michael had suddenly vanished. No one knew what happened to him. Some said he left the country. Others whispered that he'd been part of something darker, but Matthew had never believed it. Now the truth was staring him in the face. The documents in front of him confirmed it. Michael had somehow managed to infiltrate Matthew's life, using his identity to further an agenda that Matthew could never have imagined. Michael had been operating under Matthew's name for years, recruiting vulnerable people, spreading dangerous ideologies, all in the guise of faith. Michael? Matthew's voice cracked as the weight of it all settled in. I never knew. He's been using me all along. Wells nodded grimly. It gets worse, Pastor. Michael Hargrave wasn't just a recruiter. He was the leader of the entire operation. And now that you're linked to it, it's only a matter of time before this explodes into a full-scale investigation. Matthew felt the walls close in on him again. The very thing he had spent his life protecting, his faith, had been hijacked. His name, his image, everything he stood for was now tainted. The room fell silent. Matthew's world was crumbling around him. He had been betrayed by someone he once called a friend, and now he was being dragged into a conspiracy so twisted, so sinister, that he couldn't see a way out. But there was one more thing, one final piece of the puzzle that Wells dropped casually on the table. We're not done with you yet, Pastor. There's more to the story than you think. Michael Hargrave, he's not just a leader. He's been planning something big, and you're the key to stopping it. Matthew's heart raced as the weight of those words hit him. This wasn't just about a cross. This was about something far more dangerous.